Breaking news! Things are heating up behind the scenes in Philadelphia. And there are some very real and strategic moves happening that every Eagles fan needs to understand right now. We all know the goal hasn't changed, to return to the Super Bowl, and after falling short last season, Howie Roseman clearly isn't standing still. The front office is working aggressively, adjusting the roster and positioning this team for another serious campaign. And I tell you, there are layers to what's happening that go beyond the superficial headlines. But before we move on, make sure you've already clicked the like button if you're a die-hard Eagles fan, and write in the comments, "Go Eagles, this season is ours." Now, let's get straight into what's really going on. The Eagles still have their eyes locked on a potential trade target that could reshape the defensive front. Minnesota Vikings pass rusher Jonathan Grinard. This isn't just speculation floating around. There's a real connection here between Philadelphia's current roster needs and the way Howie Roseman has been managing the salary cap over the last few weeks. At the start of free agency, the Eagles were sitting at around $12 million in cap space. Now, they've maneuvered their way to approximately $32.9 million, putting them in a top 10 position league-wide in terms of flexibility. That kind of jump doesn't happen by accident. That's calculated. That's preparation. And when you connect the dots, it strongly suggests that Philadelphia is setting the stage for a significant move. Possibly for Grinard. This comes after missing out on Jalen Phillips, who landed a massive deal with Carolina. And internally, the pivot seems clear. Instead of overcommitting to a riskier option, the Eagles could target a player like Grinard, who not only comes at a more manageable price point, but also brings a level of reliability that matters in a defense built on consistency. Grinard is currently on a deal worth about $19 million per season with 2 years remaining, but any trade would likely come with a contract extension. And here's where it gets interesting. Even if that extension pushes his annual value into the $24–25 million range, it would still be cheaper than what Phillips received. That's the kind of efficiency Howie Roseman lives for. Now let's talk football fit, because this is where things really start to make sense. Grinard is not just a pass rusher who gets numbers. He's a complete edge defender. He's played in both 4-3 and 3-4 systems, showing versatility that fits perfectly with what Philadelphia wants to do defensively. He can get after the quarterback, yes, but he also holds his ground against the run, and that matters a lot more than people think. This coaching staff values edge setters, players who aren't just chasing sacks, but are disciplined in their assignments. We've seen what happens when that balance isn't there. Players who focus only on sack production without contributing in the run game don't last long in this system. Grinard, on the other hand, checks both boxes. And let's not ignore the production. In previous seasons, he posted 12.5 sacks in Houston, and followed that with another strong year totaling 12 sacks and 22 quarterback hits in Minnesota's system. Even in a slightly down year impacted by minor injuries, he still graded well and remained effective against the run. So the question becomes, what would it take to get him? The expectation is that Minnesota would want at least a second-round pick, possibly something like the Eagles' late second-round selection at number 57 overall. There's also the possibility of negotiating around future picks, maybe a 2027 second or third, depending on how the market develops. But here's the bigger picture. The Eagles currently have limited depth at edge rusher when you project forward. With players like Devont Smith and others in the mix, there's still a clear need for a proven, high-level contributor who can anchor that position group. And if this move happens, it won't exist in isolation. There are other roster decisions tied into this, including the financial implications surrounding players like A.J. Brown. There's been ongoing discussion about whether Philadelphia might move on from him, especially considering the dead cap implications and the potential for reallocating resources elsewhere. So when you look at everything together, the cap space, the positional need, the trade rumors, and the timing, it paints a picture of a front office that is actively building towards something significant. This is classic Howie Roseman. Always working, always calculating, always looking for that next move that keeps the Eagles competitive at the highest level. Now I want to bring it to you, because this is where the conversation really matters. If you're in Howie's position and Minnesota is asking for that second-round pick, are you making that deal for Jonathan Grinard? Do you see him as the missing piece on this defensive front? Or would you rather keep the draft capital and build another way? And this is where things start to connect even more, because the Eagles' current strategy isn't just about adding talent, it's about preparing for possible transitions across the roster, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Let's shift to another situation that's quietly gaining traction inside league circles: the potential trade involving Tanner McKee. The Eagles are not actively forcing this move, but they are absolutely listening. And more importantly, they've set a very clear price. If any team wants McKee, it's going to cost a second-round pick. Now, at first glance, some fans might think that's too high. But when you really break it down, it actually aligns perfectly with how Philadelphia values the quarterback position. This organization has always prioritized depth at QB, and not just for insurance, but as a long-term asset strategy. We've seen it time and time again. Backup quarterbacks in this system aren't just backups. They become valuable pieces. And McKee has shown flashes, especially during preseason action and limited regular season reps. Even in a tough Week 18 situation against Washington, where he was surrounded by backups facing starters, there were still signs of potential. That matters when teams around the league are desperate for quarterback solutions. And let's be real, there are teams out there right now that need help at that position. Pittsburgh and Arizona have both been mentioned as possible fits. When you combine that demand with a young, affordable quarterback who could develop into a starter, suddenly that second-round asking price doesn't look so unreasonable anymore. Especially when you consider recent reports that other quarterbacks in similar situations, like Davis Mills and Mac Jones, were also being discussed for similar compensation. That tells you this isn't just the Eagles being stubborn. This is the market. And here's where the Eagles' planning really stands out. They've already added Andy Dalton via trade, giving them a veteran presence who has started over 100 games and brings experience, leadership, and familiarity with offensive systems. So, if McKee is moved, the team isn't left exposed. You'd have Jaylen Herz as your starter, Dalton as a reliable backup, and flexibility to continue developing depth behind them. This is what smart roster management looks like. You build value, and when the time is right, you capitalize on it. Now, let's bring this all together with something that Eagles fans actually got to see with their own eyes. And that's Jaylen Herz and DeVonta Smith lighting things up at the Fanatics Flag Football Classic. And I'll tell you this, if there were any doubts about their chemistry, they were completely erased. Herz and Smith connected for multiple scores during the event, showing once again that their on-field connection is as strong as ever. Whether it was deep throws, quick movements, or improvisation, these two were on a completely different level compared to most of the competition. And yeah, people are going to talk about the interception Herz threw. That's how social media works. But what won't get talked about enough is how consistent he was throughout the event, and how often he looked for Smith when it mattered most. That trust, that timing, that's not something you can manufacture overnight. And this is where the bigger conversation starts to come into play. Because if the Eagles do move on from A.J. Brown, something that has been increasingly discussed as a real possibility, then DeVonta Smith isn't just stepping into a larger role, he's stepping into WR1 territory. And based on everything we've seen, he's ready for it. This isn't just about one flag football event. This is about years of production. Smith has already surpassed 1,000 receiving yards in 3 of his 5 seasons, despite often being the second option in a loaded offense. His skill set, route running, explosiveness, agility, translates at the highest level. And maybe even more importantly, his connection with Jaylen Herz goes back to their early days and has only grown stronger since. That continuity matters. In a league where timing is everything, having a quarterback and wide receiver who are completely in sync gives you a massive advantage. So if Philadelphia does enter a post-A.J. Brown era, it might not be as disruptive as some people expect. In fact, it could be a transition that feels surprisingly smooth. And when you step back and look at everything, the potential Grinard trade, the McKee situation, the cap space management, and the emergence of DeVonta Smith, you start to see a clear pattern. The Eagles are not reacting. They're anticipating. They're setting themselves up not just for this season, but for sustained success. Every move, every rumor, every adjustment, it's all part of a bigger plan to keep this team in contention. So now it comes down to this. Are you confident in the direction the Eagles are heading? Do you trust Howie Roseman to make the right calls with these potential trades and roster changes? If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and don't forget to click on the video that's on your screen right now. If you want the latest Eagles news the moment it happens, this is the place to be. Go Eagles!